Good evening, and thank you all for logging into this virtual book launch. Of course, we had hoped to have a proper party, and I'd been delighted to have welcomed Sir Keir Starmer to join us for it, but it was not to be. And there was a rumour that Rod Humphreys, the landlord from Bath, who threw Sir Keir out of his pub a few months ago, might be with us tonight, and so online or in person. I'm not sure Sir Keir wanted to come, but to be fair, Sir Keir, I can understand why not. For the Labour leader to be ejected from a pub by Labour-supporting landlord for being incoherent, in policy terms, I meant, is obviously very embarrassing, particularly given Sir Keir was stone cold sober at the time. Anyway, this is a COVID-compliant way of celebrating the publication of Red Night, serialised by the Mail on Sunday, and thank you to them for that. And here we are, less than a year after I first had the idea for this book, and now it is out. It's a testament to my publishers, Bite Back, and everyone else who has supported me in this project that I've been able to get it published so quickly. When I first conceived of this project, Sir Keir had been the leader of the Labour Party for just a few months, and the scale of the crisis this country was facing as a result of the pandemic was becoming apparent. And it must have been deeply frustrating for Sir Keir to have the reins of his party's leadership in his hands without being able to even try to make an impact in the way that leaders of the opposition are normally able to do. And for a while, there was no PMQs. Sir Keir could not meet and greet voters around the country. Indeed, he wasn't even able to meet some of his own MPs. And the job of the leader of the opposition is often considered to be the worst in British politics. And with the Labour Party going through a difficult period of self-examination just now, Sir Keir's stint as leader of the opposition is arguably proving even harder than it has been for others. And in some respects, he started with advantages. He'd been fairly well known nationally since 2008, when he became Director of Public Prosecutions. He raised his profile further by taking up the post of Shadow Brexit Secretary from 2016 until 2020, when his brief was the main focus of politicians and the media around the world. Some voters came to regard this ardent Remainer as a heroic figure. And when he became leader in April 2020, many thought it refreshing that he had not rolled off Westminster's production line of career politicians, but had instead led a successful professional life outside of politics. Yet the truth is that Sir Keir, who is hard to read at the best of times, is easily portrayed as a man of contradictions. Having attended a fee-paying school, gone on to study at the University of Leeds, spent a year at Oxford University, became a successful barrister, then a Queen's Counsel, been appointed Director of Public Prosecutions, accepted a knighthood, and finally entered the Commons, he is undeniably a member of the establishment. And yet, despite having succeeded in life, thanks to his own hard work, he seems always to be at pains to distance himself from the establishment by speaking often of his working class roots and his socialism. It is as though he is worried that the public will think less of him for having done well off his own back. His attitude is particularly surprising given the difficult circumstances of his upbringing. As is well known, his mother lived with a serious medical condition for most of her life, and Sir Keir was not close to his father. By any standards, he has done well in life, and he should embrace that. Since he became Labour leader 16 months ago, it's undeniable that some commentators have begun to wonder if the party's outlook under him is just too narrow. Others have questioned whether he is the right man to lead Labour. Some have even doubted if Labour itself has a future. And this is predictable. Under Sir Keir, Labour has failed most of the electoral tests it has been set in recent months. Even Tony Blair has chipped in, savaging Labour for lacking a compelling economic message. None of this has made Sir Keir's job any easier. Having listed those advantages that he began with, it has to be said that Sir Keir has been very unlucky in some ways. He has been left to clear up the mess created by Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters, notably around anti-Semitism. He has a fairly shallow pool of talent in the parliamentary party on which to draw. He lacks political experience, having only been an MP for 6 years. And of course, he became leader at the dawn of the COVID crisis. Having said all that, there is a sense that he is his own worst enemy. Whereas Michael Foot and Jeremy Corbyn almost certainly did not ever seriously set out to be Labour leader, Sir Keir did. And yet, having taken the top job, it is often seen that he has run out of petrol. Why would this be so? Friends and allies who agreed to give interviews all spoke of his decency. There is evidence to support this in the book. For example, even as a boy of 18, he devoted himself to working with the disabled when other teenagers were off partying. He also seems to have chosen principle over pay when it came to his legal career, taking on more pro bono work than others. In short, his backers hold him up as a serious alternative to Boris Johnson. Yet what strikes me is that Sir Keir is not yet at ease with his position. He may not even be quite at ease with himself. It's vital for the health of any democracy to have a strong opposition which can hold the government to account. Indeed, it's probably more vital now than it has ever been. And does Sir Keir, who is now close to being 60, have the energy and imagination to oppose successfully and then to capture the electorate's attention? And while working on the book, I was struck by the fact that some of those who know him well from his days as a barrister were prepared to admit that his communication skills, surely the most vital tool that an opposition leader has, are lacking. Others said as a lawyer he was over-promoted and that quite simply there were better barristers working in his field. There is a question about his vanity as well. Apparently, he always knew he was not the model for the Mark Darcy character in Bridget Jones's Diary, but he didn't mind people believing otherwise. And one colleague who attended Frank Dobson's funeral, at which Sir Keir gave a speech, said he spent most of it talking about himself. Serious political figures cannot afford to waste time on being vain. Then there is the question of how well his views sit with the much discussed red wall voters. One serious legal figure is quoted in the book as saying he can remember being in a pub with Sir Keir long after they had both qualified, when Sir Keir said in total seriousness that he didn't think anyone should go to prison for anything, ever. And even if he's changed his mind, how many potential prime ministers have ever held such a view? No red wall voter would share it. That's for sure. And beginning with Tony Blair in 1994, 4 of Labour's last 5 leaders were long-term residents of North London at the time they were elected to run their party. And the last 3 of them, Ed Miliband, Jeremy Corbyn and Sir Keir, lived within a short drive of each other's houses, feeding the narrative that the bond between Labour's leadership and the working class vote on which it was built is torn and frayed. And it's not difficult to see why a feeling has taken hold that Labour has become a party run by and for people who embody the liberal and metropolitan elite. Sir Keir, who takes the knee and who thinks everybody should have unconscious bias training, currently sits at the top of that particular tree. And again, all the polling work I've seen and done suggests red wall voters feel very differently about these things. So, is Sir Keir's personality big enough and well-defined enough to achieve the popularity that both Blair and Corbyn achieved in different ways? Or is he closer to being more like Gordon Brown or Ed Miliband. And in this increasingly unpredictable world, one is reluctant to make predictions. I think Sir Keir Starmer could end up as Prime Minister, but my view is that he is going to have to work significantly harder than he has done up until now if he is to turn his party's fortunes around. He's also going to have to be lucky. It has been very interesting to find out more about Sir Keir's life and career, and I hope you enjoy reading about him as much as I have enjoyed writing about him. And Red Night is published tomorrow by Biteback and is available from their website or from Amazon. And thank you very much for this part of the presentation. And now just a short video.
Who is Keir Starmer? He was a schoolboy socialist. He was a radical lawyer. He is a red knight of the realm. Starmer often says that his father was a tool maker on the factory floor, but he always forgets to mention that his father wasn't working for someone else on the production line. Instead, the factory was actually a small business, which his father owned. Starmer was a bright child. He passed the 11 plus and won a place at Reigate Grammar School in Surrey, where he rubbed shoulders with the likes of future Tory peer Baron Cooper of Windrush and the Conservative journalist Andrew Sullivan. He also took violin lessons with Fatboy Slim. Reigate became a fee-paying school 2 years after Starmer arrived there. Yet, despite his ultra-conservative schooling, aged 14, he joined the East Surrey Young Socialists and became a Labour activist. These are the origins of the schoolboy socialist. At Leeds University, where he studied law in the 1980s, Starmer's friends nicknamed the young socialist the king of middle-class radicals. His early 20s were marked by a similar juxtaposition. After studying for a postgraduate law degree at the elite St Edmund Hall, Oxford, he became a law student and then a trainee barrister in London while living with friends in a dingy flat above a sauna. In 1990, he co-founded the Doughty Street Chambers in London. He used his position as a barrister to assist those in need, providing legal support, often free of charge, to clients who didn't have the means to fight in court. He gave free advice in the 1994 McLibel case, when McDonald's sued two environmental activists. The success of this case helped to earn him an appointment as a Queen's Counsel aged just 39. These were the days of the radical lawyer. In 2003, Starmer became the Human Rights Advisor to the Northern Ireland Policing Board, an important advance in his career. He was then made Director of Public Prosecutions, holding this post from 2008 to 2013, and overseeing cases including the highly controversial Operation Midland, which focused on allegations of murder and paedophilia supposedly carried out by VIPs. Operation Midland was found to be a baseless witch hunt, and it made Starmer some lasting enemies. After stepping down as DPP, Starmer was awarded a knighthood in the New Year's Honours List in 2014, becoming Sir Keir. Labour heavyweights Ed Miliband and Frank Dobson backed him to become the candidate for the safe seat of Holborn and St Pancras in North London. He was elected to Parliament in 2015. The Red Knight emerged. So who is the real Keir Starmer? The schoolboy socialist, the radical lawyer, the Red Knight of the realm. Lord Ashcroft reveals all in his new book, Red Knight, the unauthorised biography of Sir Keir Starmer. Available now at Biteback Publishing, Amazon and all good bookstores.
As leader of the opposition, he is the Prime Minister in waiting. So I thought it was important to find out more about him. And having worked for many years as a high-profile barrister and then as the Director of Public Prosecutions before entering politics, I wanted to examine his beliefs to see what kind of Prime Minister he might make. Then, of course, as Shadow Brexit Secretary, he played a key role in the very protracted Brexit debate that dogged this country for years, and that makes him interesting too. And as Labour leader, he's in charge of the party at a time when it's going through a period of reflection. So that also makes him a worthwhile biographical subject. And no, I have never met him. And from that point of view, it is a truly independent book. No, I don't think the others were prickly. They all took the view that they would let me get on with it. They were pretty relaxed. Sir Keir was different because he actively asked people not to talk to me. It says something about his character that he was so defensive, I think. I suppose everybody's upbringing affects their character, and Sir Keir is no different. His mother was very ill throughout most of her life, and that placed a great responsibility on his shoulders from a young age. And I think that must have given him a sense of duty and a purpose, which in my view, he has carried with him all his life. His father was not a particularly straightforward man by all accounts, and they were not close. And I've wondered if that lack of a bond between father and son may have made Sir Keir more insecure than he might otherwise be. And I certainly think it spurred him on to do well and prove himself. And he has obviously done very well in life. Well, I think that's a weakness of his, to have emphasized his so-called working class credentials when, as you say, the evidence suggests otherwise. And his story is a very positive one, proof that hard work is the route to success. And I think it would be far more meaningful if he spent his time emphasizing this rather than claiming to be a straight up and down working class guy, when actually most would agree he was never typically working class. His parents owned their own house, albeit with a mortgage. His father ran his own business and he went to a grammar school. That's not typical of the working class experience. Well, the Mail did. They found out that he had attended Reigate Grammar School at the time he was Director of Public Prosecutions. He had omitted this fact from his entry in Who's Who, and the Mail thought this omission said something about him, and I tend to agree. It looked like it was a self-protective move on his part, but it was certainly naive. Of course, this would emerge at some point. Anyway, it seems obvious to me to check some other details of his life. And lo and behold, it turns out, as I say, that his father ran his own business and owned a house. I think the king of middle-class radicals label was a joke between him and his friends. But yes, I agree with you. He is obviously sensitive about the fact that he is not a working-class hero, but is instead far more middle class than he cares to admit. In this more meritocratic age, none of this should matter. I suppose he thinks it'll be easier for Labour voters to connect with him if he talks about those aspects of his life which can be billed as working class, such as his father being a toolmaker. It does risk being a bit disingenuous, though. It's a bit like the way Tony Blair, who attended a top public school, used to speak with a Mockney accent. The public can spot these things a mile off, and they're more likely to warm to politicians who are not afraid to be themselves. Well, as a politician, I don't think you would ever want to have to talk to voters on the doorstep about some of the cases that you've mentioned. To that extent, he is a bit exposed by his legal career, but other lawyers would understand why he, as a human rights lawyer, took those cases up. They would say that in a civilized democracy, the case for the defense must be made. And I'm sure that when it comes to appealing to the electorate, he will gloss over some of the work he did defending controversial characters, because in the age of the soundbite, it's not easy to explain in 15 seconds why you defended a terrorist or a murderer. And I cannot necessarily criticize him for taking on those difficult cases, but it's noteworthy that he took on so many. I mean, these cases do reflect badly on him, in my opinion, and they are both running sores. There are still a lot of aggrieved people out there who are personally affected by what happened. And as you say, in Operation Elvedon, many journalists were held on bail, in some cases for years, And that was ultimately down to his decisions as DPP. And it wasn't against the law for the reporters to have published what they did, and senior legal figures ended up supporting this view. So I think this shows he has questionable judgment, and maybe he was not the brilliant lawyer we've been told he was. And as for Operation Midland, you only have to read the words of Harvey Procter in my book, where he talks about his life having basically been ruined, to see how disastrous Sir Keir's handling of that case was. He endorsed a policy where all so-called victims should be automatically believed, and this resulted in one of the biggest police scandals in recent history. From everything that I've seen and through all the interviews, I think it was quite long in the planning. He was politically engaged as a schoolboy. He then seems to have shunned politics at university, but he was very involved in hard left fringe politics in his 20s. And I think that having become a barrister, he saw that he would only make a difference if he entered the mainstream. And the day he applied to become DPP in 2008 is the obvious moment that he acknowledged this publicly. And by becoming DPP, he was effectively bringing down the curtain on his full-time legal career. He was in his mid-40s by then, and clearly knew this was the springboard to becoming an MP. But not just any MP. Being DPP for 5 years meant he would become a very well-known MP. Yes, and I think that's fair comment. There is a quote in the book from someone who worked closely with him when he was shadow Brexit secretary. And they say his plan was not to get what he would regard as the best Brexit for Britain. It was to have no Brexit for Britain. And the huge irony of this is that his decision to go down this path resulted in Britain ending up with a fairly hard Brexit and giving Boris Johnson an 80-seat majority. So that didn't work out too well for Sir Keir. I think for Labour, this was also disastrous because so many old Labour voters are Brexiteers. And all of this suggests that Sir Keir doesn't know his own voters very well, which has to be a worry for him. Well, I see what you're saying. But remember, Blair was a barrister for a very short period of time. He then became an MP at, I think, at the age of 50. And so he was by and large always a politician. And Sir Keir, as we've said, was a lawyer for 25 years and only became an MP aged 52, which is late by any standards. And he does approach things from a lawyer's perspective. And that's almost certainly because he spent so long in the law doing paperwork, spending hours working out arguments and so on. And when you think of the way someone like William Hague could dodge and weave during a House of Commons debate, and then you look at Sir Keir's performance in the chamber, you do almost feel sorry for him. And I'll add, his lawyer's mindset does look like a handicap for him in that sense. And I'm not surprised his opponents focus on this. He's not particularly nimble, that's for sure. It's certainly interesting that the word forensic has somehow become a term of ridicule in his case. I think it is a problem. Beginning with Blair in 1994, 4 of Labour's last 5 leaders were long-term residents of North London. At the time they were elected, in fact, to run the party. And the last 3, Ed Miliband, Jeremy Corbyn, Sir Keir, live within a short drive of each other's houses. And the perception is that they exist in a bubble. And this has helped to damage the bond between Labour's leadership and the traditional working class vote on which it was built. And I can see why a view has taken hold that Labour has become a party run by and for people who embody the liberal and metropolitan elite. Their priorities are not the same as those who live in former mining towns in the north of England. And that goes to the heart of the problem, Paul, for Labour. Some say the entire Labour project is doomed anyway because of its attempt to connect with both socially excluded white working class northerners and the more progressive urban elite. And appealing to both sections of society is a very tough call. Probably not deliberately, but that's what it amounts to in practice. If you think about the last two opposition leaders who have gone on to win elections, my good friend David Cameron and Tony Blair, both of them were clear from the word go that they were going to change their parties and give voters good, positive reasons to look at them again. They knew that making a strong case against the government of the day wasn't going to be enough in itself. It may be that Sir Keir understands intellectually that this is what he needs to do, but if so, we have yet to see that kind of approach in practice. Sir Keir, it's true, made a good start. But I think much of that was down to the contrast with his predecessor. And after 5 years of Jeremy Corbyn, we suddenly seemed to have a serious professional leader who could put Boris Johnson on the spot at PMQs. It was also clear that he was determined to deal with the problem of anti-Semitism, and expelling Corbyn from the party was a bold move for a new leader. I think he stalled for three main reasons. Two of them were arguably beyond his control. Those are the Tories' vaccine bounce and the pandemic, making it harder than it usually is for an opposition leader to make an impact. But the third reason is that when he has had a chance to set out his stall, he hasn't managed to show what he wants to do or why. And people were left wondering what it was that he was offering them, other than not being Jeremy Corbyn. And the people who left Labour, for many reasons over many years, haven't yet been given a convincing reason for coming back. Well, one point is that he needs to put more energy into the case for Labour than he does prosecuting the government. Another is that he needs to remember that Labour members and his target voters are not the same people. He has often seemed reluctant to be bold for fear of offending the people inside the Labour Party. And above all, funnily enough, I think he needs to relax. At the end of the book, I compare him to Ronald Reagan, which is something that probably won't happen to him very often. White House advisors used to say, let Reagan be Reagan, meaning the president was at his most effective when he followed his instincts. It'll be interesting to see what happens under a strategy of let Starmer be Starmer. It might turn out that we see a left-wing metropolitan lawyer who deep down is still Mr. Remain. And if that's the authentic Starmer, at least voters can decide if that's what they want. It doesn't, Paul, it doesn't seem wise to make any predictions about politics anymore. What I can say is that Labour doesn't have a history of brutally dumping its leaders without giving them a chance to fight at least one general election. So I would be surprised if Sir Keir was elbowed out of the way. Anyway, which MP who is sitting in the Commons now would succeed him? There's no obvious candidate as far as I'm aware. And another thing to bear in mind is that nobody knows when the next election will be held. There may not be as much time as people think. His principal weakness is that as leaders of the opposition go, he is not the greatest public speaker. I don't want to be rude about him, but let's just say I don't think he'll ever be in the class of a Neil Kinnock when it comes to making speeches. And communication is key, and that's a problem area for him. As for his strength, I suppose it's that he is a fairly sympathetic character. He has a very loyal group of friends, and that says something about his human side, which can be useful in politics. I think it's also healthy that he had a career outside politics and is not someone who spent his entire adult life in the Westminster bubble. How do you define Sir Keir Starmer politically? Well, first of all, he calls himself a socialist. His friend Peter Tatchell is quoted in my book as saying he was on the radical left when they first met 35 years ago. And I'm not sure he's moved too far from that position. But frankly, I'd be pushed to define Starmerism because I don't think his ideology is fully formed yet. I do think he is quite woke, and by that I mean he risks falling into the trap of supporting identity politics, which I happen to regard with great suspicion. Well, that's in fact a difficult question. I think it's that he comes across as being quite secretive. I had expected him to be more open, but he guards his privacy very carefully. Well, he might do, and it might be in coalition with the SNP, and I'd be very interested in that joint manifesto. But only the electorate will decide, of course. He certainly had experience of running a big organization, the Crown Prosecution Service, which is more than can be said for past leaders of the opposition. That's very much in his favor. Whether he's able to appeal to a wide cross-section of society and ask them to put their trust in him to lead the country is another matter. But if Boris Johnson's rather chaotic approach to politics earned him an 80-seat majority, who is to say that Starmer's more down-the-line approach won't work for him? Well, I certainly don't dislike him, that's for sure. I would say he's done very well in life, and that is to be admired. He clearly works hard, and he has done good things in his party, for example, as I mentioned, to fix the anti-Semitism problem. That's positive. I'm sure that we would find things to agree on if we could actually meet. Well, no, I certainly wouldn't say it was dull. It's true that Jacob Rees-Mogg was a more colourful character to research. And in fact, Jacob attended the physical launch that we have of his own biography. In Starmer's case, I would say that it was interesting to find out about his legal career and very interesting to hear how good a lawyer he really was. Not all of his former legal colleagues think he was in the top rank, by the way. They really don't. I was told Boris Johnson is by some margin more intellectually gifted than Starmer, and I think this shows and will continue to show. Well, Carrie Johnson for me is interesting in her own right. She's not just the Prime Minister's wife, she's worked in politics at a certain level herself, and she's also very active in the field of animal rights, which is close to my heart. And my research of her life and career so far has proved fascinating. And she is the Prime Minister's wife. They're very much a partnership in Number 10. And I think she's a very interesting subject for a book, and I will continue to do that. And that's not the only book that I'm bringing to an end. On my military side, I'm hoping in November to publish Falkland Islands heroes, of those men in the military that won gallantry awards during that 1980s war. I mean, I'm not sure that Keir Starmer has proved in the 18 months or so since he became Labour leader that he does represent a huge threat to Boris Johnson. And then again, we've been living through such a strange period politically because of COVID. It's been hard for Sir Keir to really get onto the front foot. And there have been times when he has seemed competent and measured. And those qualities are certainly the ones that serve him best. Of course, even in normal times, Boris Johnson is very difficult to get to grips with. He's clever, but he's also frustratingly evasive in an intellectual sense. And Sir Keir might therefore find it easier to spar with someone who is a bit more straightforward in that sense. Yeah, that's a toughie, Paul, but no. I think taking the knee is a gesture which can make people on all sides of politics very excitable. But more than that, I think the photo of him in his office with a photographer in tow, taking the knee like that is a gift to those who argue that he is the wrong man to be Prime Minister. I think it could come back to bite him. One of the political rules that the most successful politicians tend to follow is not to go in for controversial photo opportunities. And I think Sir Keir broke that rule when he took the knee in the way that he did it and under the circumstances that he did it, and then advertised the fact. Clearly, we all support the general Black Lives Matter, but not necessarily the political arm in the United States of Black Lives Matter, which is a very radical left-wing organization. Well, I mean, at the risk of stating the obvious, I would characterize their relationship as strained. There are persistent rumors that Angela Rayner is preparing to move against Sir Keir, though I'd be surprised if she had the support to mount a successful challenge. And I'm not sure Labour would do any better if she was in charge of the party anyway. But she is a thorn in Sir Keir's side, and her presence shows one of the fundamental weaknesses of the way the parliamentary Labour Party is organised. She was elected as deputy leader by Labour members, and Sir Keir, as leader, has no ability to remove her if that's what he decides he wants to do. That's why he ended up giving her more job titles after he tried and failed to demote her a few months ago. As Boris Johnson, I think I've got the words correct, said so memorably, I fear the more titles he feeds her, the hungrier she will become. Well, really, I haven't ever thought very deeply about parallels between Sir Keir and Kamala, but it sounds as though the questioner has. I do know that both have pretty poor personal ratings at present, so that's another similarity to add to the list. But I'm quite reluctant to draw too many parallels between American and British politics because they are very, very different, and I've learned that in all the polling that I've done in the USA. Well, to the best of my knowledge, Sir Keir doesn't have much of a relationship with Joe Biden as yet. I'm not sure they've ever met. But I do know that he and his team have studied Biden's victory and have had briefings with one of Biden's pollsters on how the Democrats won black, white, male, working class voters. Ed Miliband and one or two other Labour front benches knows quite a number of Democrats too. And I'm sure Sir Keir would be keen to maintain the special relationship. But at the moment, Biden's priority is obviously on the British government. But I'm sure Sir Keir is a fan of the special relationship. I find no reason to think otherwise on that, Paul.
Keir Starmer has a huge job on his hands. Can he put Labour back on the political map after its worst election defeat since 1935? Starmer became the MP for the central London seat of Holborn and St Pancras in 2015. He rose swiftly through the Labour ranks, becoming Jeremy Corbyn's shadow Brexit secretary. He promised to honour the Brexit vote, but later became the architect of Labour's second referendum policy and said he'd campaigned to stay in the EU. In 2019, the voters elected Boris Johnson's Conservatives with an 80-seat majority. But Starmer had made his mark with Labour supporters and, in early 2020, beat Rebecca Long-Bailey and Lisa Nandy to become Labour Party leader with more than half the votes in the first round. He made a strong start, making decisive moves to clamp down on anti-Semitism and winning praise for his forensic approach to PMQs. His early polls were impressive, but cracks soon began to show. Starmer's complaints about the government's handling of the pandemic earned him the nickname Captain Hindsight, while at the same time, his wish to lead a constructive opposition frustrated those who wanted him to be more aggressive towards the Tories. His attempts to brand Labour as a more patriotic party brought furious backlash from the left, while COVID restrictions made it hard for the leader to get out and about to explain his message. People on all sides began to ask what Starmer stood for, and his poll ratings began to slide. Meanwhile, the successful COVID vaccine rollout was good news for Britain, but problematic for Starmer because it massively increased the government's popularity, making his job as leader of the opposition even more difficult. Labour voters had turned against him as he took to the streets to campaign for the local council elections in the summer of 2021. The voters' verdict on Starmer's first year was stark. Labour lost the once safe seat of Hartlepool, as well as 8 local councils and mayoral elections in Teesside and the West Midlands. Does he have what it takes to turn things around, unite his party, and bring back the voters Labour need to win? You decide. Read Lord Ashcroft's new book, Red Knight, the unauthorised biography of Sir Keir Starmer. Available now from Biteback Publishing, Amazon and all good bookstores.